Well, I'm here with Dr. Mario Martinez. He specializes in how cultural and transcendental beliefs affect health and longevity, which is of interest to me. He lectures worldwide on his theory of biocognition, which we'll talk about. Um, and of interest to me, Mario, you talk a lot about trauma, but it's not what the mainstream conversation about trauma is. Trauma, victimhood, and even empathy, which you have I'm almost certain you must know, given your beliefs about it, you must know of or know Paul Bloom, who wrote a good pop psych book against empathy, which seems to align basically with what your theory is. He writes books, blogs, hosts a YouTube channel, probably a lot more that we can get into. Most important thing, Mario, thank you for being with me.
Oh, you're welcome. Glad to be here.
First of all, just to parse terms for people who are unfamiliar, there are people who visit our channel who have a range of knowledge about psychology in general. What is neuropsychology? How do you parse the difference between psychology and neuropsychology?
Neuropsychology is a specialty in psychology that emphasizes the how the brain is affected by illness and how illness affects the brain. So it's really between neurology and psychology,
Hmm.
looking at the functions of the brain. And when I was training, it was mostly looking at what happens when the brain's not doing well, when there's trauma, when there's and when I mean real trauma, real physical trauma, uh, or an illness of systemic problems. But now there's a move, at least in my area, where we're looking at what are the causes of health with the brain, and looking at longevity and what does the brain do when it's doing well, rather than what happens to the brain when it's not doing well. So it's really a shift into a more functional way of looking at things, and rather than just maintaining pathology, looking at the causes of health.
It sounds like it's a very smart folk psychological. It's more complicated than just folk psychology, but it's what you can observe how people are interacting in life. What really is interesting to me is how much you focus on cultural aspects of a person's life. What got you into that realm? Have you always been resistant to kind of, I don't know, psychobabble or bio bunk,
Yes,
or is that something you walked into?
yes. No, I tried it for a while and it didn't work, and I felt like I was kind of living in some kind of delusion. But I think the important thing about culture is that I come from a multicultural. My father was from Spain, my mother's Spanish, French, uh, Cuban. So I was really very aware of the differences in how cultures affect. At first, I thought how you view the world, but now I know how it affects your longevity and so forth. And culture, I like to define things very clearly. Culture is really the collective beliefs that we have about survival and meaning. So it's everything like aesthetics, ethics, aging, the sense of well being, longevity, all those things. And those collective beliefs create a reality that the biology steps into rather than the other way around. And I'll give you a lot of examples as we go on, but basically it's cultural neuroscience, cultural anthropology, cultural neuropsychology, all with a culture component, because science, as you know, looks at mind and body. No one is denying that there's mind and body communication, but what I'm bringing in is mind body communication in a cultural context, and
Hmm.
that's what's so important.
Would you mind giving an example? So, like, what is the difference? I'm thinking about mind body connection as an individual, mind body connection in a cultural context. Although I'm being, I'm almost playing like a weird devil's advocate position
No, that's
because
good.
I understand our vision of ourself is bound up in our community. But
Yes, yes.
but
Uh,
yeah, if you could parse those.
sure. From the neuropsychological um, level, we have the Eastern mind and the Western mind. It's just the same brain, but one brain it learns one way and the other one learns another way. The the Eastern mind is more collectivist, interactionalist. The Western mind is more individualist. And how do you know those things? Well, you can give a test to a group of Eastern individuals, and you show them, let's say, a guy sitting on a bench at a park, and you interfere so they'll forget, and then you have to ask them to remember what they found, and they'll say, well, there was a man there, and behind him there was a squirrel, and then there was a lady sitting next to him, and there was this and there was that interaction. With the memory concept of the Western is he was wearing brown shoes, a green shirt, a white belt, the individual. That's how we
Right.
train. The other thing, even more neuropsychological, this part of the brain, the prefrontal medial lobe, has to do with self. If you have injury to that area, not that it comes from there, but that's a portal. If you have injury to that area, you don't know who you are. You can mistake yourself with a lamp. You just don't know. But if you ask with a functional MRI, and we learned a lot with a functional MRI, which is in a real time looking how the brain responds based on blood flow and neuromaps. And you can ask somebody, okay, talk about yourself. And you see that this area activates. Talk about your mother, your friends, and it goes somewhere else. But if you talk to an Eastern person, talk about your mother, talk about yourself, it stays there. It's a collectivist way of learning. So even the brain has to learn the collective view of our reality. And then the immune system and the nervous system and the endocrine system have to respond to that.
What do you mean by that?
That, for example, if you shame someone, you're going to have molecules of inflammation, like tumor necrosis factor, just the language. And I'll tell in a minute how that happened, but that's okay, the individual. But if you try to shame someone from the Eastern culture, only when you shame their family or their country or their work or their group do they have that kind of inflammation. So it follows that kind of thing. Another way to look at it is there's some countries that, including the United States, that see menopause as a real problem. You have to treat it. It's a problem. Low self-esteem, hormonal replacement. You have the hot flashes. You have reduced libido. And you think, well, that's a universal thing. It's a hormonal thing. You go to Japan, again, culture. In Japan, they see it as konenki, the second spring. They don't have any of that. They don't even have a word for hot flashes. You ask them what's hot flashes, they'll say hot flashes. They don't have a word for it. Self-esteem goes up, libido goes up. They become models for other women with their wisdom. Totally different, a cultural interpretation of a biological process.
So seeing yourself as, I guess at the most basic level, seeing yourself as part of a whole moving parts, while preserving integrity about yourself,
Yes,
is helpful.
Culturally constructed. In archetypes, this is a man here, there's a woman there, there's a father, this is that. And we are designed to pay attention to what I call culture editors. These are the people that our cultures will give power, like a doctor in a clinic or a clergy at church, a father, mother. And what those people do has a strong placebo or nocebo effect on your life. A doctor could tell you, look, you have 6 weeks to live and you're done in 8 weeks. So it's got a lot of power. But what I found with centenarians is that they're outliers. They don't buy into the cultural editors. They create their own reality. They bypass their reality. And getting back to trauma, one of the strongest arguments that I have about this trauma thing is that these people have gone through hell. I've interviewed centenarians who have been in concentration camps, raped, earthquakes, everything, and they don't have all the usual things. They could have some problem. You can have PTSD, of course, but they don't have that traumatized victim mindset. And in many cases, they work out on their own because they don't have access to medical services and so forth. So it's not that we're so fragile. We have 150,000 years as Homo sapiens that taught us how we do things and how to have resilience with thriving. But that industry that's been created now is a blaming industry. If you this, it's your father. If your mother is this or that. So there's no agency. It's all, what can you do for me to fix me, rather than what am I going to do for myself? And that has psychoneurological implications incredible. There's something called internal and external locus of control in psychology. Internal locus is a very agency-oriented. What do I do for myself? How can I get your help for me to help myself? External, what are you going to do for me? Consistently, the internal locus of control need less medication when they have a wound. It'll heal faster. They come out of surgery a lot better. They deal with illnesses a lot better because they have an empowered immune system. The others are that passiveness, and that helplessness has psychoneurological implications. If you are helpless, your natural killer cells will kill almost anything, go down in population and in effectiveness. If you're empowered, goes right back up. So it has implications over the biology.
It sounds like part of the reason that it's helpful in general. Sorry, this is like your like a 101 course reaction, but it sounds like part of the reason it's healthful to have to be part of a culture and have a mindset where you are a part of a culture is not because, oh, hey, if something happens to me, the culture will pick me up per se. It's more like you have a role to play within a larger culture. Whereas there's a way of feeling cultured in the West. Ask me how I know, where you can have some of that social shame that you talked about, and the idea is it's like I'm afraid I'm going to die a social death. Like everybody is going to look down upon me or judge me or something like that, which is
Yeah.
completely unhealthy if unhealthy means anything. And it's interesting to hear you talking about people. First of all, it sounds like you have a theory about health that you've worked toward and confirmed by septuagenarians who you've interviewed, talked about their lives, who have centenarians, not septuagenarians, sorry, who have a story to tell. And like, if anything is traumatic, some of these stories are traumatic. And so it at least says an N of however many people you've interviewed have had experiences which you could call, emotionally traumatic, who did not have these consequences that would be predicted by current models. I find that fascinating. How long have you worked with people 100 years or older? How long have you been interested in that
For about
that
20
building?
years. And
Wow.
I've interviewed about 180 in those 20 years. There's not a lot, but you see there's 600,000 centenarians in the world, and our population is about 7.8. So one centenarian per 13,000. So if you interview 10 centenarians, you have a huge population there already. But getting back to what you were saying, which is really important, we need our cultures usually for 18 years. So if we want to leave the culture, if we want to individuate, we do it with gratitude, even if
Mm.
we've been abused. Not, I'm so grateful that I was abused. I'm grateful that I had something there that allowed me to shape. But the moment you go into individuating, which is for me that I need to do, the culture will admonish you and try to bring you back. And the only way that you can come back is as a failure or as admitting that you can't make it without them. It's a
Right.
collectivist way of looking at the world.
Right. And I like what you said, that there's a self-fulfilling cycle, I guess, cycle that feeds on itself, where you're looking, if you're adopting a label of traumatized or victimized or something like that, there's really no going back from it unless you completely change your mindset. So if you're saying I'm victimized, traumatized, and you're saying I need some professional to help me, and what the professional who acknowledges that diagnosis does is say, well, yeah, let's dig into the past a while. And there's nothing you can really do about it, but keep paying me $100 every time you come to see me, and we'll keep digging into the past and
Sure.
reliving it.
Yes.
Right. So that's a vicious loop.
Yeah. And what's happening too is that now you can call yourself a coach and do whatever you want to. Carl Rogers started that in a good way, about humanistic psychology and everything. But Tony Robbins created the concept of coaching,
Right.
and anybody can be a coach. So what's happening is people are transcending their professions. GPs are becoming psychotherapists, chiropractors are becoming neurologists, and it doesn't work. I'm a neuropsychologist. I'm not a cardiologist. And what they do is they look at their own trauma, their own darkness, and their own fear, and they create a model of change based on that. And it doesn't work like that. You have to have training to understand that it doesn't work that way. And yet, these books are for bestsellers and all these things that are going on, but they're really selling something that is not really good science.
So how did you decide, when you're working with people 90, 100, older, that they're not born equipped to handle the slings of whatever misfortune the world may throw at them? They're born to live that long. They're just like a genetic specimen, as opposed to us other plebes who have no hope of living that long. What makes you think that it's so cultural, is so relevant in that process?
Well, that's a great question, and there has to be an answer. Otherwise, I would just be making up a theory. First, in my work and in the work of many others, it's consistently by correlation that their genetics is only 20%. And the way you look at it is, when did your parents die? I interviewed a what they call semi super centenarian, 107-year-old Zen master. And I asked them, when did your parents die? Because that's the correlation. How long do they live and how long are you going to live? That's a very gross genetic marker.
Mm.
Of course, he gave me a zinger. He said, my parents die when I die. But then I went around and I asked his assistant, now find that information for me. Mother at 75, father at 70, 107. Now, genetics helps, but it's only a constituent. It's not even necessary. And that's the good news. If you have good genetics, that's great, but you have to trigger that potential. It's not like there it is. And some of these people don't have the genetics. The other piece of information and evidence is that when you get twins, they're born with, and same identical twins, they have the same DNA, and they have the same what's called DNA methylation, which is the level of inflammation, anti-inflammation, and other kinds of things about proteins and so on. They're the same, but as time goes by, their DNA methylation changes because they've been affected by environment and individual experiences. So even twins, it's still 20%.
Interesting. Yeah, it's not. There's a tendency to look at human beings as like, and DNA genetics as something like they're set ingredients in the
Yeah,
pie that you're baking,
only
and it's
propensity.
just insanely more complicated. It's complicated to the extent that you can't fathom how complicated
Yes,
genetics work and how they're
yes.
triggered. I don't know.
You
I think
can't.
the Human Genome Project helped us understand that.
Yeah, and they were pretty much humbled because they were expecting for hundreds of thousands. They came up with about 20, 22,000. That was it. So it's the
Right,
permutations that they make. You can't change the sequence of genes. That's DNA fixed. What you can change is how those genes are expressed one way or
right,
another.
right.
That's the key. And that has to do with family illnesses and all these other things that there are only about 3 or 4% of congenital illnesses that you're just born with them, and that's it. It's a genetic mistake, but the rest is acquired.
So, like when we think about here in the good old West, we think about heart disease, and so father has heart failure at in his 60s. I can pretty much bet that I'm going to have some kind of heart failure then, and I'll start testing for it and ruminating on it. Is there how narrow do you get with culture? Dynamics is everything, rather than, or I guess 80% of things is to be precise,
Yeah.
rather than you know what I mean.
Well, in that 80%, you have the lifestyle, you have of course the environment. Is it toxic? You have food and thought process and all that. But just because a father had this at this age, it's not a genetic sentence. It's a propensity that needs to be looked into. But remember, you don't get all your genes from your father. You only get half of chromosomes and so forth. But the way to look at it is that, and this is what I do with people who have these issues with family, is that let's say you have type 2 diabetes in the family. Okay, type 2, and the doctors will tell you, hey, look, the probability is very high because your uncle has it. All of that is bad science. So what you have to do is you have to ask yourself, who in the family is an outlier who didn't die from diabetes? How were they? And you're going to find that they're different. They have a different way. And the reason that the things, these genes express themselves, is because you're living in the same place, you're eating the same food, you're thinking the same things, and the propensities are very similar. But when they move, for example, the other way around, look what happens. You have twins that are adopted, and some of them go to a place where there's a propensity for cancer, and the probability for cancer for that twin goes up. So it's the other way around.
Right, right.
It's reciprocal.
Well, you can imagine how this is a bugaboo of my own. I work in the addiction field, and people want to impose this genetic model on consequences of what addiction is, or
Yeah.
that a person will become. And first of all, I mean, I just think about whatever addiction is. If you're going to use the word, I think the only reasonable way to think about it is it, addiction is just an involvement that you become wedded to, that it has net negative consequences, but you don't decease. I mean, that's absolutely almost 100% cultural relevance. Like
Yes, very much.
what are you into? What are your habits? So that's interesting to hear that, I'm in my own small frame of mind where I'm thinking about how silly it is people are putting genetic variation on addiction and making claims. There are things that we just take for granted otherwise that we believe is purely genetically driven. that we don't even take the time to realize the obvious, that your lifestyle will determine a lot. And you're saying you're putting, not only pulling the brakes on those genetic theories as a whole, or extrapolating from them too much, you're taking it into overdrive and saying that lifestyle is, let's look at lifestyle. First of all, it's what we can control, and it's everything.
Very much, and especially with addictions. I've done a lot of work with addiction. I've been director of programs. I was one of the directors of the first comprehensive psychiatric facility for a prison in Tennessee, all that. One of the problems is that even professionals will mix obsession, compulsion, and addiction. They're different. They're different. And obsession, as you know,
sure.
for your group, for your obsession is an intruding thought that affects your life, that you have no control. That's an intruding thought. That's an obsession. A compulsion is a behavior that intrudes into your life. And an addiction has to have some kind of an external process, not food, because food is a compulsion, that has some psycho value, psychotropic value that is used as a way of not confronting your inner self, your inner excellence, and your ability to work through trauma. As you know, people who have addictions are not very introspective. They're very external. They don't delay. They not able to delay too much reinforcement, and then there's a propensity. But again, with twins, which is this whole thing started in the 50s when the American Medical Association called alcoholism an illness from bad research. It's good that they did that, because then you can treat it with insurance or not. But all the research, most of the research is really badly designed research. If you look at twins, again, twins from parents who were alcoholics, and they say, well, you have 5 times the probability. One twin goes to a high socioeconomic safe, the other one low socioeconomic unsafe. The one that is unsafe is the one that expresses the so-called genetic predisposition. The other one doesn't. So it's environmental. And what we have done is that we have created a situation that we turn it into an illness. It's not an illness because it can't fit the definition of an illness. An illness, even medical, it doesn't fit, because you have onset. When does it happen? Okay, here. Diagnosis, fine. Course, that's where it fails. And prognosis. Okay, why does it fail, of course? Because you don't have cancer, and you can't wake up in the morning and say, I'm not going to have cancer today by what I do. An alcoholic doesn't, or an addict doesn't do it, and they don't have it. That's the first thing. The second is that, well, but look, course also means that you've had damage up to a point, and when you start again, the damage is still there. Well, fine. You take poison, and you stop the poison, and there's damage. You take the poison again, and there's damage again. Does that mean you have an addiction to poison? It's totally off, totally off. But it's seen as an illness, treated as an illness. AA has, sorry to say, failed miserably. They're really good at first because they help, but you don't want to identify yourself. The people that don't work out in AA or NA, come and see me, and I tell them, look, when you're drinking, you're an alcoholic. When you're not drinking, you're not an alcoholic. You're a human being. And meanwhile, we want to find out what the human being needs here. When somebody cocaine, I don't want to know how many lines you did. I just want to know what you're avoiding today. And what you're avoiding today? Let's look at that. What excellence are you avoiding? What conflict are you avoiding? And what are they doing most of these places? They tell you, okay, today I'm going to do just one line. Tomorrow, or let's talk about how you are unable to control yourself. You go to these places, and if you say, hey, I'm doing really well, I'm just doing really well, and don't even say that you're drinking socially because you're out, but let's say I'm doing really well, fine. But if you say that you ended up in the hospital because you got drunk and you almost died, everybody comes to you and you get all that kind of attention. So it's set up for victimhood. People need treatment, but don't need to be treated as an illness. It needs to be treated as a sociocultural dysfunction, and you get actually better results.
Oh, you opened up a few cans there. You began by saying something is bad or somebody is not thriving, then, oh no, what do? We compartmentalize And so that is, we're going to put that into the medical model. And so now we have to reconcile, even though this isn't medical per se, or there's no inherent disease, there's no ineluctable draw to a substance, there's no, you're not diseased, a diseased human being, as though you would be if you had cancer. We'll put it into this context, and now we have to figure out, well, how do we make this a disease? And so first of all, that's a bad cultural beginning to that, to the
Because you
idea
can
that,
only treat it medically with
right,
medications or extracting something, or that you can't treat it in any other way because it's medical.
right. Well, just the vulnerability that gets us there, where we have someone's not thriving. What do we do? Well, let's medicalize it, and
Yeah.
that's like top of the hat. And so, right. And I think you and I have slightly different definitions of what addiction is. Although I think it's just the way. I think you're just subcategorizing in a neater way than I am. You probably have a higher IQ than I do to be able to do it. but all points taken, and the idea that whether someone is drinking or not, whether somebody is doing a drug or not, to me that's meaningless. What's meaningful is what's going on holistically in a person's life.
Yes.
Which gets us to, I guess there are two big topics I want to discuss, although I feel myself wanting to veer down another road. We talked a little bit about trauma, and you gave the difference between, actually, you studied brains with actual physical trauma to them as opposed to emotional trauma. You discussed a little bit about victimhood, which is actually itself toxic. And thank you for indulging me in the world of addiction, which I'm always fascinated by. I just heard you say something in passing recently, and I wonder how this gets into the whole ball of wax that you're experimenting with right now in your life. I love your definition of empathy, or being an empathic person, or especially the idea, the pushback you kind of give to the diagnosis of empathetic person. Will you talk a little bit about that and distinguish between empathy and compassion, and where you see the thriving and where you see the a person could go wrong having that mindset?
Okay. Empathy is dangerous. Vulnerability is foolish. Okay. So let's go back to then developmental neuropsychology. Even evolutionary biology. Let's go to animals. When a zebra sees a lion killing another zebra, they have a fight or flight, but the fight or flight is they light up mirror neurons, which they can't tell me from the other thing. And that mirror neuron says, you got to run, because it's like it's happening to you. That is a survival component that we have. We have that. Well, the empath will say, I feel with you. They're literally feeling with you because they light up their mirror neurons, and then they can't feel the pain of the other person, but they feel the stress of imagining the pain of the other person because they're into the mirror neurons. It's a primitive survival component. What do? Okay, since we're beyond survival, we have meaning now. Then we moved on to compassion, and compassion is, I feel for your pain. And there's even a technique, the simple technique that I use neuropsychologically. So for example, let's say that you have a problem and I come in, and since I'm a human being, I'm going to have an empathic reaction. I'm going to feel, oh, how sorry, but I stop immediately because I don't want to get sick from what I'm doing with you. And I stop and I say, okay, how can I let the brain turn off the mirror neurons and the amygdala? And how can I take it into selfing? Very simple. I'll say, okay, he's wearing a pink shirt. I'm wearing a blue shirt. He's got a book in the back. I don't. That kind of process forces the brain to go into selfing, which is here, and it turns off the mirror neurons. And then I can say, Zach, what can I do for you? Is there anything I can do for you? The problem with the victims, the pathological victims, they don't want you to do anything. They want you to witness their pain. That's it. More. But that's the way to come out of that. Now, vulnerability, same thing. Vulnerability, it's, you notice when animals, when there's an alpha, the other one will turn on their back and open up their stomachs to say, you can kill me. That's what we do. It's again, evolutionarily, biologically, it's dumb to be vulnerable. And they say, but children do it. No, children do something that's called a trait testing. And in trait testing, they do selective trusting. They look at this, they look at that, and then they trust. So in vulnerability, You drop it and you go into selective trusting. You don't want to be.
Vulnerability is dead end, right? I think in the
Yeah,
mind of a child developing,
that's
to
it.
put it in plain terms, what I
Yeah,
think you're saying, kids are creative and they're watching for who to latch on to, right?
yes.
And who to
Because what
trust,
the people
right?
that promote this don't know any neuropsychology, or at least they avoid it, or they certainly don't know psychoterminology. They say, well, look, be like a child. Children are vulnerable. No, they're not vulnerable. They have selective trust. Of course, they're more vulnerable in that the lack of they could be abused, but they don't say, here I am, do whatever you want to me. They have some self-preservation that allows them to be subjective and have some selective that trait testing. So if you want to be like a child, then okay, then be selectively trusting.
Mhm.
Get out of
Can I ask
vulnerability.
can I ask a question about you? You mentioned a psychological trick that you do on yourself, and I don't know if that's you developed it because you need to, or you developed it because you're helping people through it. Are you? Gosh, I almost used the word vulnerable to describe you, which I won't do now since we're talking about it in that context. But are you primed to have difficulty with that feeling of empathy, being tender to the pain of another person to a large extent, you personally, or are you?
In my work, yeah, in my work, I saw a lot of pain, and I felt for these people, but I didn't know how to come out. I didn't know
Yeah.
how to really go into the evolutionary component and the neuropsychologist. Okay, I'm a neuropsychologist. What the hell's going on here? What do I need to do? And I was not feeling well, and not my blood pressure was high, and all that. So all right, so I asked myself, what does the brain need in order to turn off this? Well, you turn it on when there's no separation of self and other. You turn it on when there's selfing. And when there's selfing, it can't be selfing and mirror neuron. They're incompatible. So when you do that, you are actually selfing. You get out, amygdala quiets down because there's no fight or flight anymore. So, okay, now this is me and this is you. What can I do for you as me?
Hmm.
And empaths don't have very good health. They don't have good health at all because they don't sift them. And I went to I did a workshop at I like to go to nice places to do workshops. So I went to Costa Rica to one of the spas there, and there was this woman who was a professional victim. She would go to each of the workshops and cry, and the empaths would go to them and just like sirens, just and one of the psychologists said, how can I deal with this? So I said, look, try this technique. She did, and she said that the next time that the woman came on and everybody started, she did the simple differentiation and everything just completely dropped. Your blood pressure drops actually. So it's what I try to do is I try to take real complex things and make them very simple.
There's a I forget who reminded me of this. It might have just been somebody I live near, but told me who is a clinician. Oh, I do remember who it is. He was talking about the idea of when he was training to be a lifeguard when he was 16, 17, 18 years old. They do train you, and he was in the ocean working with a lot of surfers. So they do train you when you swim out, if you're rescuing a person and they're latching on and you're both drowning, not to continue trying to rescue that person. As brutal as it sounds, you're supposed to kick
Yes,
off.
yes,
And it's the analogy is not it's not exact, but it seems to apply in this case. If you're a clinician, if you're a friend, or if you're a clinician, if you're someone who cares about the plight of another human being, actually, um, maybe to an extent, feeling that person's pain, okay, that's nothing morally wrong. But if you're actually trying to help them and preserve your own sense of self while helping them, it seems like trying to feel their pain so that you're both feeling it will get you locked in some kind of a hell that you can't really
yeah.
get out of. It's
You
not, there's
both
no way
drown with your
forward.
analogy. You both would drown, and there's no value at all in feeling somebody's pain. There's no value. Cultures will tell you be empathic. There's no value at all because you're not doing anything for the person. And
Hmm.
if my work is to decrease suffering, it's sure as hell not going to change with my being an empath. Empathy,
Con-
it's just a beginning. Step one.
Contrast that with compassion, lest people think that we're some kind of monsters who are just talking about, being against empathy.
Well, with compassion, even a part of the brain, when you do functional MRIs, you can see empathy and you can see compassion. You can see how the brain goes into a different. Compassion says, "Okay, I'm over this. No, it's not me. No, it's not me. This is me. Okay, what can I do now to help?" And that's what mothers do with animals. For example, they get out of the mirror and they see my child, and then they go and help, but not with empathy. Empathy won't work because you can't tell the difference between you and self existentially. I mean,
There's a theory that any bad thing that's happening to a person, especially anything that seems pathological in nature, well, that necessarily goes back to some kind of a trauma, even if they don't know it. I'm just to take the reductio ad absurdum, or not even absurd, even if the person doesn't know it. Okay, there's some trauma. Let's look for it. Let's think about what your trauma was. Okay, well, triggering these traumatic events. I don't think that it's a guess to say that you and I both disagree with that method. But then there's, okay, people are coming in talking about their traumatic past. And so there's a way of nurturing that person's worldview, I suppose, at the same time as saying, okay, you are here now. So I guess trauma, it seems like to you, after you sent me a blog that you wrote, I've looked at some of your things. I'm going to make a guess. I think an educated guess is that it sounds like you would say something that happened to you that you feel is traumatic. Okay, that's your truth. The thing happened. I have to. I'll take your word for that. And when it happened, it didn't feel good. Take your word for that. And it meant that there was some kind of an impediment now that you've formed from getting from point A to point B because you're worried about it. And now that you're here now, you need to look forward, figure out how to become healthy, and be confident that you can get through that thing. Would that be an accurate way to portray your
yeah, but
views?
I would go a little further from what I learned from Centenarians again, is that I don't see it as traumas. I see it as a challenge. These are
Sure.
challenges that we have in life. And for
Mm,
example, stress is a cultural interpretation,
right.
because you and I are talking now, and our contextual reality that we're sharing is we're talking psychology, and all of a sudden a lion shows up and behind you, and you're going to have the empath thing. You're going to have but to run. Is the lion a stressor? No, the lion's out of context. If we were talking about lion training, you would say, hey, look, there's the lion. There's no stress. So it's a cultural interpretation based on how we perceive. So the same thing happens with this. If you say, here's an example, I'm going to give you a real good example here. This centenarian was in a concentration camp during the Soviet Union. He was from Estonia. So he was 18 or 19 or so. And so I asked him, they're not Pollyanna. That's another thing. I asked him, so how was it? He said, it was terrible. It was a terrible thing. These people were in. What do you remember the most? What did you take with you? There we go. I remember that one of the guards was around my age, and every once in a while, he would sneak some food into my cell, and we became great friends. Then, when I was released, my mother asked me, why didn't you write me? And he started laughing. He said, Mom, they didn't let me write in the concentration camp. And they started laughing. Look at the way that he dealt with challenges.
Mm.
And there was no trauma to this guy. He was riding a motorcycle at 96. So it's not, but so it's a challenge. And you can have a challenge where you can have resilience, or resilience with thriving. And they have resilience with thriving. In the US, there's a lot of psychology about resilience. In France, there's more resilience and thriving. Resilience is not enough. You have to have thriving. Resilience, you get up and you clean your dust off and you fall again. No, thriving is not that it's not going to happen again. It's that how do I deal with things in a way that they make sense from me, from what I learned, not avoiding, but the victim avoids. The victim says, I'll never let anything happen to me again. And of course, that's unrealistic. So the word challenge to me takes it out of the pathologizing and the medicalizing things. And yes, for example, you are raped, you have been victimized. There's no question about that. The challenge is that you either become a victim or you overcome that. If you use that as a way of manipulating other people, and no, I can't do that because I was raped, then you go into victimhood and your health will not be very good. Think about it. When your health doesn't work well with something, it means that in a way of your evolutionary process that you shouldn't be that way. Otherwise, victims would be in great health. They're not. So you want to be able to thrive and with a challenge. In some cases, you need help. In other cases, you don't. So I rather clean it up and just you see it as a have traumas happen. Challenges, yeah, a lot of challenges happen to me. like everybody else. And when you look at it as a wounded hero, is different than looking at it as a victim.
I like the way that you open that up. So the 10,000-foot view is more like life is something that is filled with, it could be happiness, but certainly there will be challenges. To everybody, I guess if you were going to use the word trauma, what everybody knows is whatever the most traumatic thing is that's ever happened to them in their lives. So by definition, if you're opening up this clinical term trauma, then a person could think about, well, what's the worst thing that I remember happening in my life? What's the worst memory that I've created about how things have gone in my life? Okay, that was traumatic. If you think about life as full of all sorts of challenges, and plus, if you get beyond a challenge, then there is thriving. Then
Yes.
that sets you up for just a continuous, sense of purpose, I guess, and
Yes.
ability to. And I like what you said too. There is trauma. There's this resiliency training in the U.S. that has, I guess, existed necessarily. If everybody's going to be traumatized, then there needs to be some sort of resilience training, or else we're all doomed. But that just sort of assimilates the trauma theory into all these resilience boxes. So it doesn't do much. I like the idea of then thriving, which it sounds like your model opens that up too.
Yes.
So it's not just resilience. Oh, let's look at all the challenges. It's scary. But can I be resilient about this?
That's right.
It's let me rethink the way that this challenge has happened. How did I overcome it? If I didn't, how can I overcome it? And then how can I be more equipped to deal with challenges in the future? Because
in the
that's
future,
what it
right?
will hold. Right.
And in neuropsych, I try to deal with it neuropsychologically, because you put out a context and your brain will try to deal within that context. So look at the difference of if I say, okay, tell me about the first trauma that you had in your life. Immediately, trauma has to have a victim. It's happened to me, and there's a helplessness component, and you archive that and you bring it in. If I ask you, when was the first challenge you ever had in your life? That's a fighting, empowered.
It is, yeah. That really
and you
is.
change the conceptual thing, even if you were a victim at the time. Always a challenge. So if it was a challenge, what I do? Well, I remember I did this and this, and you're not going to bring it out as a victim, because victim has a cluster of context of helplessness. The other was from the Greek mythology, you're a hero, you're a Titan or an Athena by having that, and that's the kind of thing that you can bring out. I've worked with a lot of victims, and when I go into the challenge thing, at first I say, "You mean traumatized? No, challenges. Is this a challenge?" And then they bring the trauma. Yes, that's a challenge. What did you do? They bring out archived information that they've never had before, because the context doesn't allow you to see that. The context will say, trauma, this is trauma. Hero, this is hero. And it won't let you come out of that. So therefore, the archives that you're bringing are not looking at the meter of herohood that you have, if there's such a word. It doesn't look at it. I'll give you an example. Look, this person had a inflammatory problem and shaming from childhood. His father was the town drunk and all that. So he developed some arthritis in his left hand, because he loved to play the Cuban drums. So you're going to have something that's going to punish you. So you can't do it. It wasn't an ear, it was a left hand. So anyway, so we go back and we look at shame, and the antidote for shame is honor. And we're beginning to look at honors as an anti-inflammatory process. We'll be to test that. So, okay, so he goes back. Since his meter was a meter of picking up on shame consciousness, he couldn't go back to a time when he was honorable. And we kept going, at a contemplative state. We go now. Okay, how about this? Tell me something that happened to you that you felt a little proud. That's another way of bringing, you felt proud of what you did. Immediately he got back and he said, okay, I was big when I was 12, and this bully comes over to hit this little boy, and I stood up and I defended him, and I felt so good. I said, that's honor. Let's take that honor and the technique that I use, and that the thing stopped. I followed him for 10 years, never had it again. Now, that doesn't happen all the time, but that's a way of looking at how you can recontextualize something that has psychoneuroimmunological implications.
So I love it. The ameliorative process is just a human concept that, in a way, it's like a birthright to be able to feel.
Yeah.
I feel you should be able to feel honor. You should be able to feel challenges. You should be able to feel like you can overcome challenge. You ought to feel like you have a culture that you're part of a thriving culture. There's no reason in today's day and age, I guess, not to have those things. If you have the money to go to a psychiatrist or a psychotherapist and talk about indefinitely and talk about the traumatic events that have happened to you, I see no reason why you couldn't have all these other things that make you thrive as a human being.
Yeah.
I mean,
And it's epigenetically transferred from Homo sapiens for at least 80,000 years, epigenetically transferred, meaning that the environment had an effect on your gene expression, which means that you have gene expression of resilience with thriving. And I was very fortunate to have really, really good mentors in the fields. People like Bransford, who was at Vanderbilt, he was the one who debunked Skinner, just really. But I had one mentor. My first mentor was a really irresponsible surfer in Miami, and this guy was in a wheelchair. And he, I was doing a practicum with him, and one day I was late, and he said, "You want to keep working here?" I said, "Yeah." Then get your ass over here on time, because I'm in a wheelchair and I'm here on time. Okay. So then I said, after a while, so what do you think about me in psychology? He said, well, you have an encyclopedic ignorance of psychology.
He said that to you, or you said that to him?
To me. He said that to me. And he said, that's what I'm here to teach you. You have an encyclopedic ignorance of psychology. When I got my degree, and my mother was Cuban. So I said, so what do you think now? I said, Cuban doctors a dime a dozen. But he loved me.
Right.
That's how you get that resilience. And how could I argue with this guy? This guy's in a wheelchair with muscular dystrophy.
Do you know Stanton well, or did you only interact with him based on his messaging to you?
No, I just met him with messaging. Yeah, he seems like quite a guy.
Well, he's been that for me. I think he's aware. I mean, he has you would almost call it radical, although you wouldn't call it that, because it's just a different way of thinking and sort of opening up and seeing the bigger picture. And which it's obvious that you have that way of thinking, and it's not radical. It's just commonsensical and thoughtful. But it is an outlier position, right? And I had that propensity. I sort of was like that when we came into contact. So his mentorship to me, which is an unofficial sort of mentorship, was kind of that. Like, I'm going to throw a barb at you, and we'll see how you handle that.
Yeah,
and see if it changes. And never once did he say you ought to think this way.
Right,
which is
giving
cool.
you options. And unfortunately, we don't have rites of passage anymore. The rites of passage are the iPhone, and we have to have rites of passage. Both men, women, anybody has to have rites of passages to find that you have resources that you can take care of with the help of others, but you also have resources. So the other thing about culture, I'm Spanish. My father was from Spain, and French Spanish, and we lived in New York. I was growing up in New York, and we lived in an Irish German neighborhood. So I was going to Catholic school there, and culture and all that. So one day I go over to my mother and I said to her, I think I want to dye my hair blonde. I don't know why, but I knew, because the girls weren't looking at me, because the Spanish weren't popular in those days. So she said, "You want to do it? Do it. You want to look like a clown? Do it." That was it. So you learn that kind of harsh love, tough love kind of thing, and it allows you to discern, this is love, but I'm not going to get away with victimhood. That's the difference. Which what you got, I guess, with Stanton, the same thing, that he challenged you, and you got to be challenged.
Right. It makes me want. I know the real answer to this. I'm going to say this sort of in jest. Have a daughter who just our firstborn, so give her tons of love and just compassion. And every time we go to see a family member, especially if it's novel, she's just kind of drowned in presence and love, and it's like, can do no wrong. And her mother and I don't want that for her necessarily. Yes, the love, of course. We don't want the spotlight on her, can do no wrong, tell me what you're thinking. We'll hug you for it. It's almost like, so we joked the other day, I think one of us should beat her up because we want her to build some resilience in her life. Of course, the way to do it is
Yeah,
socializing.
you build a little narcissist who's expecting the world just because I'm here. That's all I need to do. My presence is all I need. So yeah,
Right.
you're right. You have to create some challenges and teach to win with modesty and to lose with honor. That's
Yeah,
it.
right.
And
Yeah,
those
great
kind of
point.
behaviors are really important.
Mario, I burned an hour with you really quickly.
Oh yeah, you're right.
Can I it's really fascinating. There are too many lanes I could have gone down. I could have honed in on one, but it's really interesting to you. I know you've written books, and I haven't read any of them yet, but I want to. What will you recommend? I guess given the topics that we've broached so far, I guess
I
one,
think yeah,
I'm
starting.
interested in your overall theory about culture. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was saying it's better to start with the mind body code because it's a good foundation and then the mind body self is more like with the culture, but they're both really basically saying what I'm saying. And I have extensive bibliography and techniques at the end of each of the chapters, and also a glossary for the new words. So there's a lot of science there. I'm not just making this up, but some people don't want to hear that because that's not what they want. They want quick fix and they want blaming. That's it. My daddy did it. My mommy did it. Okay, so that's okay now until something happens again, and then you have to find another blame.
Did you write a book that reflected what your overall conception about culture? Like, was that an inaugural kind of writing for you? I'm very interested in that one. Like,
Yeah.
if I can go back through an archive and see, all right, when was this guy really thinking about? Aha, here's the link. I'd be interested.
Yeah, and I think that's what in bringing the cultural component it's woven into both books. It's there all the time, and the cultural learning and the cultural portals, all these things that we have, and especially one of the most dangerous is the cultural portal of middle age. There's no such thing as middle age. It's imposed at middle age. If you're at 45, 40, 50, whatever it is, then you have to act middle age, look middle age, and get sick like the middle age. And if you say, I want to come out of the portal by saying, hey, I want to go back and get a PhD. You're 45. No. You got to save first for your retirement, and you're going to have to go to a nursing home or whatever. And there are countries in Europe that social service will give you a cane at 50 because you're going to need it eventually.
Ooh.
And then the research shows that if you walk with a cane without needing it, your body will adjust to the cane and you're going to need the cane. Self-prophecy.
That as I'm approaching on that age, so the idea that middle age is a mindset. I really like Ellen Langer. Are you familiar?
Oh yeah. Ellen's a good friend. Yeah, she's done a lot of work very similar to what I do, and she's done a lot of simple experiments that are brilliant. And what's with longevity and context.
Right. Okay. So next time we talk, we'll have to discuss more on that. Hopefully, by the time we talk, it won't be when I'm 40. I'm 36 now. So hopefully it won't be when I'm 45, but
when you're 45,
sooner than that.
Worry about what you're going to do for the next 50 years.
Love it.
That's the way to look at it.
So I have your YouTube channel, which I'll link. I have your blog, which I will link, and I think a website of yours, which I can link to.
Yeah.
Your books, which you've mentioned. Is there any other channel or outlet or interface that people can connect with you through or connect with your work?
Yeah, I have on my website. I have a few things by biocognitive.com, but there's a really comprehensive course that I did online course with Sounds True. It's called 100 Years Young. That's really very good. It's extensive and it's reasonable, and that you can only get it at Sounds True.
Well, I'll make sure to link to that. And thank you so much for your body of work and your willingness to chat with me. I really appreciate your time today.
Say hi to Stan.
I'll do that. Take care, Mario.
Well, enjoy it, and it was a pleasure meeting you.
It was an absolute pleasure. Thanks. I hope we can do it again.